Hollywood in 1980 didn't need a muscle-bound hero. It needed a symbol of elegance, sensuality, and quiet danger. When Richard Gere stepped onto the screen in his custom-tailored Armani suits for American Gigolo, the world held its breath. He wasn't just an actor, he was a promise of pleasure. With a half-smile and eyes that could melt the resolve of the most guarded socialite, Richard Gere became the most expensive commodity on the silver screen. A man who seemingly sold his soul for fine silk and the adoration of elite women. But when the neon lights of Los Angeles faded and the disco beats of the 80s died down, a different Richard Gere emerged in the shadows. He was a man torn between the perfect gentleman image and a private life haunted by a desperate need for control and the thrill of the forbidden. They say that to play Julian Kay, Richard didn't need to do research. He simply brought his own secrets to the camera. This isn't the fairy tale of a billionaire and a streetwalker in Pretty Woman. This is the black file on the real price of pleasure. The clandestine nights at Malibu Estates, and a scandal that nearly turned the world's greatest gigolo into a ghost. Following the massive success of American Gigolo, Richard Gere was no longer just a star. He was a luxury brand. The studios demanded he maintain the image of the sophisticated, mysterious bachelor. But behind the scenes, Richard craved experiences that were raw, gritty, and dangerously real. He was frequently spotted at isolated resorts in Malibu, estates where the elite held parties that cameras were never allowed to document. It was there he met Sloane, not an actress, but a party fixer for the 1%. Sloane was the woman who knew exactly what lay beneath the floorboards of every politician and mogul in California. She possessed a cold, razor-sharp beauty, the look of someone who had seen too much corruption to ever believe in love. Between Richard and Sloane, there was no romance. There was only a transaction. Richard found a release from the suffocating pressure of fame, while Sloane found the ultimate pawn to infiltrate the highest circles of Hollywood power. They met in abandoned villas overlooking the Pacific, where the roar of the waves drowned out their whispered transgressions. Richard began to play a game where he was no longer the master. He borrowed the danger of his characters and dragged it into his reality. The white nights of vintage wine and traded secrets turned Richard into a debtor of the darkness. Sloane began to record their conversations, capturing moments where the world's most charming man revealed his fatal flaws and his clandestine political ties. By 1990, Richard Gere needed a hit to reclaim his throne after a series of box office duds. Pretty Woman arrived like a miracle. His role as Edward Lewis, the lonely billionaire who finds love with a girl on the street, turned Richard into the ultimate national husband. The world fell in love with the romance, but ironically, while he was saving a prostitute on screen, Richard was being strangled by a vampire in real life. Sloane was no longer satisfied with small payoffs. She wanted a seat on the board of the very studio Richard was signed to. She threatened to release the real Gigolo tapes, recordings and photographs that proved Richard was not the refined Edward Lewis, but a man addicted to power plays and unorthodox sexual habits. The pressure from Sloane drove Richard into a state of visible paranoia. On the set of Pretty Woman, those charming smiles shared with Julia Roberts were the result of immense psychological suppression. While audiences saw a confident tycoon, behind the lens stood a man trembling at every ring of his telephone. Sloane began appearing at premieres, sitting silently in the back row with a small recorder in her hand. A living reminder that Richard's crown could turn to ash in a single night. The breaking point occurred at the legendary Chateau Marmont, the place where every Hollywood secret is born and eventually buried. Richard decided to face Sloane one last time to end the blackmail. He brought a suitcase full of cash, but his true intention wasn't a payoff. It was an ultimatum. Inside room 54, amidst a haze of cigarette smoke, a violent confrontation erupted. Richard, driven by the instinct of a cornered animal, tried to seize the bag containing Sloane's master tapes. Suddenly, the flash of a hidden camera exploded through the window. A freelance photographer, hired by a third-party rival looking to topple Gere, had been lying in wait. The mechanical shutter screamed, click, click, click. In that blinding white light, the Edward Lewis persona vanished. In its place was an aggressive, frantic Richard Gere, caught in a physical struggle with a woman in a scene of raw depravity and violence. The studio fixers intervened instantly. They stormed the room, confiscated the camera, and negotiated with Sloane on the spot with a figure she couldn't refuse. Total silence or a permanent disappearance from the industry. Sloane vanished from Hollywood that night, taking the original tapes into the abyss of history. Following the near explosion at the Chateau Marmont, Richard Gere took a startling turn. He began to embrace Buddhism, Tibet, and the philosophy of detachment. The public praised him as a star of profound spiritual depth, a man who had found the light amidst the sins of Hollywood. But those in the inner circle knew the truth. It was the most perfect mask Richard had ever worn. His devotion wasn't just for peace. It was the most brilliant PR strategy in history to scrub the sinister Gigolo image of the 80s. He used the silence of meditation to drown out the screams of his past. However, a deep solitude began to take root. Richard was slowly pushed to the fringes of Hollywood, not for a lack of talent, but because he had become a symbol too dangerous to fully control. He lived his later years as an exile in his own glory, always looking toward the Malibu horizon with a lingering fear that one day Sloane might return with a tape that was never destroyed. Richard Gere remains a legend. When we watch American Gigolo or Pretty Woman, we see a timeless gentleman with an irresistible pull. But behind the Armani suits and the sweet dialogue lies the brutal reality of Hollywood. Every pleasure comes with an invoice, and sometimes you spend your entire life paying to keep that invoice private. Richard Gere taught us that in the world of noir, no billionaire is truly romantic, and no gigolo is ever truly free. Everyone is a puppet in a play staged by the ghosts of power and money. Richard chose the path of silence, but in the fine lines around his eyes, one can still see the shadow of that night at the Chateau Marmont. Was Richard Gere's charm real? Or was it a masterfully directed play to hide his darkest corners? Do you believe in the billionaire saving his love, or the gigolo trapped in a web of blackmail? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to unlock the next Black Files of Hollywood. We'll meet again in the dark, where the truth is always waiting for the flash of a camera. Who do you want to see next? Sylvester Stallone and his muscle-bound rages, or Sharon Stone and her lethal basic instincts? Let me know.